Hey, Aidy Burrows here for Creative Shrimp, and welcome to this first main Blender 2.8 tutorial here, and also the first Blender 2.8 tutorial on this channel as it happens. But rest assured, we have been working pretty hard behind the scenes and there should be many more to come. The 2.8 UI changes have been coming pretty thick and fast, but they seem to be locked down enough now, and so I think it's time to unleash some proper 2.8 content. If there's anything that goes too fast, just jump into the comments and we'll see if we can help out. So let's jump into Blender and take a look. This is what it currently looks like by default, except I've added this little section on the bottom right of this default layout workspace that we're in, just to help show some of the key presses there. So as I say, everything is default. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start by showing the preferences, which we can get to using the edit menu, or perhaps I can just switch this 3D viewport over to the preferences window and take up a little bit more space here. And since there's so many different ways you could configure Blender, this is completely straight out of the box. Nothing has been altered yet. As you can see here, I'm actually selecting with the left mouse button now. And also we have the spacebar action set to play. We're not going to be doing too much animation in this project, so perhaps I'd be better suited to setting this to tools or search really. But we still have hotkeys for these. Tools would be shift space and search would be F3. So again, I've elected to just leave all that as default. There are a couple of things I'd like to change though. So for example, in the interface, I'd just like to make things a little bit easier to read. So I'm going to turn that up to 1.1 in the resolution scale. And since we're going to be working with a lot of nodes in the shader editor, let's come over to our add-ons. And then what we'll do is filter this by node. That'll just show the Node Wrangler add-on. And this is going to give us a lot more shortcut keys and just general features that are going to help speed up our workflow there. Talking about speed ups, let's go over to the System tab, and I'm going to enable CUDA in the Cycles render devices, and I'm just going to try and go all guns blazing there just to try and speed up as much as we can should we find ourselves in Cycles. Here I'm just going to jump in with another newer version of Blender to show another slight interface change, which I thought was worth mentioning after I finished the tutorial, which is this menu at the top is now packed into these three horizontal lines that we can click to open it out. And we don't need to manually save changes anymore, as changes get saved automatically due to this checkbox. But to be on the safe side, we could always just click this Save Current State anyway. So we've set up Blender, so now let's go and set up our scene. For our road, we don't want a cube, so I'm going to press X and delete that. And instead I'm going to go Shift A to add in a mesh plane. That's a little bit flatter and more road-like. That's pretty much the majority of our modeling section done. Almost all of the illusion is going to just be in the shader. So talking of that, let's jump into shading. So I'm going to jump from the layout workspace over to the ready-made shading workspace. And we can see we now have our node editor here, our shader editor to be exact, and with apparently no material. But we do have a material in our scene, which we can find by clicking on this pull down. So I'm just going to select it there. And this is our ready-made principled shader, a very handy PBR material that we can use for most tasks here. So the majority of our work can just be working on the texturing rather than the shading side. Something else to note about this shading workspace is that it's set this top 3D viewport into the Look Dev shading. This is a new shading mode to 2.80, which we can also get to using the Z key. We get this pie menu now. There's Look Dev at the bottom. This is going to be a really handy mode to be able to just jump in using this environment here as the world lighting. So if we use the pull down, we can actually switch that by clicking on the sphere icon here. I'm going to switch this more to a city-like road environment. And you can see also we're not using any of the scene's lights or the actual scene's world instead, which we can see over here is just this dark color. And this environment will become slightly more obvious if we just make this all the way metallic and then all the way completely smooth. You can kind of see that reflecting now in that plane, even though we didn't have to manually set that up in our world shader. Our road isn't going to be metallic, of course, so I'm going to set that down to 0. And then as shown, we've also got our standard rendered view. So I'm going to press Z and jump into that here. And so we've got a bit of overall lighting from this dark gray world, which is no metaphor for the real world, of course. And then we also have this lamp in the scene. I'm going to leave this pretty much as it is, but I'm just going to move it closer to the plane. So I'm just going to press G, move that over there. And from this perspective, just move it over there. All right, so the next consideration is if we're jumping between Cycles and Eevee, it'd be useful if this lamp was actually as strong as it is here in both Eevee and Cycles, basically unifying our lighting. Now, I believe that should happen by default now for us. So let's just test that. Going over to the Render tab, I'm going to switch over to Cycles.
And yeah, that lamp looks about the same strength. If we come over to the lamp settings, we can see we've got this 1000 watts. And if we come over to switch our renderer over to Eevee, and again, come back over to our lamp settings, we can see that this is also set to watts. Just quickly, I'm going to come back over to the cycles setting though, and just switch this from CPU to GPU, since we set up our CUDA preferences before in our preferences editor. So let's get that speed up working for us. All right, let's switch back over to Eevee. The next thing I'd like to organize here is in the outliner, such as putting things in their own collections. However, first a quick note that in 2.8T, the icons to the right might now be different from what you're used to. That's likely just down to the filter that we have just above, where we can choose what is shown there now. So I'm going to double click on this collection here. I'm going to call that road. And just to pull the camera and lights out, I'm going to select the camera in the outliner and press M to move it to a new collection, which I'll call camera, enter, and then click OK. The next thing I'll do is take this light and press M. We can press it in the 3D viewport or in the outliner, by the way. So we can press M here and put that into a new collection, which I'll call lamps. All right, let's select the plane. And what we're going to need to do in our shader editor here is now set up our bump. Now what I like to do is to try and align that with thinking in terms of also creating a displacement image. So we have two different nodes for this. We go Shift A and find our vector section, and we have our bump node there. And then again, Shift A, vector, displacement. I'm going to place that slightly underneath. So the normal socket of this bump node can plug into the normal input of our principled shader. And what we're going to do is we're going to plug something into the height. So to do that, I'm going to go Shift A and add in a texture, gradient texture, just to demo this, and take the factor output and plug that into the height. Now, if we want to see exactly what this node is doing, this is why we have the Node Wrangler add-on enabled. I can now go Control Shift and now click on this node. I'm going to click it again to move down to the second output, and we can see that we're getting a black gradient from the left side to the right side here. Instead of that, I'm going to switch this over to a spherical gradient. Now, often you're going to find after making a little change like that, you need to update the viewport by just sort of moving around in it a little bit. And the default mapping for this, the thing that is informing this vector, is starting it over here on this plane. I want this to start from the middle so we can actually see a circle on this plane. To do that, again, thanks to the Node Wrangler add-on, we can just go Control T, and that will automatically generate the texture coordinates and this mapping node for us. Now, I don't actually need that. I really only just wanted this texture coordinates. So I'm going to take this and go Control X to delete it while maintaining our connections through. And instead of the generated coordinates, I'm going to set this to object. When we update our viewport, we can see we're getting this in the view. All right, I'm going to left click and drag across these, press G, move them off to the side, just to give us a little bit more space to add in our color ramp, which is under the converter section. Drop that in. And now Control Shift click this instead, and we can see the results of this color ramp. To increase the contrast on this, I can just bring these edge flags in a little bit, bring that to about there. So essentially what's happening, instead of it being a smooth gradient throughout, a large part of it in the middle here is going to be flattened out. And now if I just Control Shift click on this principled BSDF shader, it's going to remove that temporary viewer for us, which is just an emission shader, and show us the results of this bump map on this principled shader now. So I'm going to set this roughness up a little bit as well, 0.2 for now. And we can see we're definitely getting some bump happening on this. Now for the displacement, we're not really going to get what we want out of Eevee for this. So let's switch over to cycles, and I'm going to plug the displacement output here into the displacement input of the material output itself. And then since this is causing some confusion here, I'm going to just drop this below so things aren't getting tangled up. Then I'll unplug this normal, and I'll plug this into the height of the displacement. And we can see now we have that in the viewport again. But it's not actually displacing the geometry though. To do that, we're actually going to need to switch this over to experimental. We're going to come over to our modifiers tab. We're going to give this a subdivision surface modifier. We're just going to keep the algorithm to just simple, and we're going to set this to adaptive. And we'll see it still doesn't show up anything. We just got one more setting to look at now. We can go over to the material itself, come down to the bottom. And since the key presses are getting a little bit awkward there, I've just added this little section again to this shader workspace. And then down at the bottom, we have this displacement section under our material tab of the properties window. And we can find our settings section. And under the displacement method, we can set this to just displacement only. And now we can actually see we get actual geometry in our scene rather than it just essentially being kind of a lighting illusion. I'm just going to come over to the modifiers tab though and take the dicing scale here just down a little bit, 0.8 maybe 0.5, just smoothing out the top of that. The lower this setting goes, the higher the resolution of what we're using here, but that's good enough. So the main thing I want to point out here is that with these default settings, strength at 1, distance at 1, and scale at 1 on this displacement node, what we're getting in the viewport, if I just press 1 on the numpad to jump into front orthographic, is we're using essentially a 1 meter scale. If I press T to bring up the tool shelf and use our measuring tool here, just left click on that, and then if I left click and drag from here and go upwards, you can see that's basically a meter. And then I'll just press the delete key to get rid of that ruler and go shift space to switch back to the select box. And press T to hide that again. So there's multiple ways we can get to everything. All right, so if I take the scale of this and set this down to 0.5, that's now half a meter. And the consideration here is what are the most extreme highs and lows of this road that we want to make. Now I think we'll just do this about 5 centimeters. And that means our scale is going to be 0.05. Let's take a look at that. So that's not going to be displacing it massively. It's going to keep us within sensible range. And we can still use the full extent of black to white in all our nodes. Now to have this bump node essentially replicate that, we're just going to set our distance to the same thing, 0.05. So what I'll do now is come over to Eevee. And we can see actually the displacement node is having an effect there, which is very cool. I'm going to plug this bump node back in though, into the normal socket, and so things don't get too confusing, I'm just going to unplug that from the displacement material output so that we're not accidentally getting double the effect. Next I'll go shift and right click and drag across this point just to add this little rerouting node. So I'm going to press G and just move that down a little bit like this. And now we're basically set up to be able to work in Eevee with our procedural nodes, but also to be able to switch this around and actually see a physical representation of that geometry shifted in real 3D space and not just a lighting illusion. Alright, so now we need to talk about reference because we need to get clear on exactly what it is that we're actually trying to produce. As you can see, there's a whole bunch of asphalt, otherwise known as tarmac, images, which is what we're trying to create, but there's so many variations. This I'm viewing in PureRef, by the way. I'll leave a link for more details on that. But essentially, if we take a look closely, asphalt is basically lots of tiny stones mixed in with some kind of tar material. Sometimes those little tiny stones are more obvious to see than others. Here the different colours are a little bit more noticeable, and some roads have different levels of aging throughout. Now I'm going to try and aim for kind of this sort of thing. Probably I'm going to freestyle it slightly, but this is a good solid platform to spring off. Alright, so we're going to approach this by just focusing on the bump side of things for now. Colouring is actually going to be quite simple, although we'll add some variation to it a little later. For now, I'll just turn that down to be a little darker. We don't need this gradient texture. Instead, I want a Voronoi texture. So I'll go Shift S and switch that to a texture, Voronoi texture. And then I'll zoom in a little bit further. And I'm just going to click this down arrow on the color ramp and I'll reset that color ramp. I'm just going to give ourselves a little bit more space on top here since we don't really need to use this window. So I'm going to hover the little cursor in the top right corner of this window until I get the little plus icon, the little crosshair I suppose, and then I'm going to left click and drag to the right and I get a big arrow here, but I'm not going to collapse into that window. I'm going to collapse the 3D view into this file browser. So I'm going to shift position to here and then let go. I'm also going to switch this window over to a UV editor just in case we want to alter those coordinates here for some reason. So instead of using this object coordinates or even the UV coordinates for that matter, which gives us this, I'm actually going to use the generated coordinates, which is basically the same as the UV coordinates, as we can see there. To take a look at actually what this texture looks like, we can Control Shift click onto this node a couple of times. I'm going to update the view by just scrolling around a little bit. So we can see the lighter areas here. That's going to represent a raised surface, so anything above 0.5. And mid-grey or 0.5 is going to be thought of as our mid-level or neither raised or lowered. And black is going to be pushing into the surface. And since we have our displacement set up here, we can pretty easily hook that up there, switch back over to our cycles, Control Shift click on the principled shader, unplug this bump node out of the normals, take a look around and we'll be able to see all these little pockets, these soft gradients down, almost like it's in some kind of very smooth sand dunes. I'm actually just going to help things speed up slightly by setting the viewport down very, very low to around 5. It'll make our viewport a little bit noisier, but we'll still be able to see clear enough. Let's switch back over to Eevee, and just so I don't get confused, I'm going to unhook this and plug the bump node back in. Alright, so on this Voronoi texture, instead of using closest, I'm going to set that to crackle. Let's Control-Shift-Click on this a couple of times and take a look at what we've got. And if we crank this scale right up, I'm going to take that up into the high 50s. And now this is starting to resemble a load of little stones. Let's take a look at Control-Shift-Clicking the principled shader itself to see how that actually looks. So that's a pretty good start. So the reason I've gone for this more crackle look rather than the closest look is because they have this much more rounded, smoother look to them. The edges between are all going to be sharp, but each raised surface in the center between those cracks is all smoothly interpolated. So I'm going to switch that back to crackle, as that gives this much more chipped, stoned kind of look. It is a little on the digitally, overly perfect look though, so let's mess around with this. What we'll do is introduce some distortion into these coordinates. So let's go Shift A and add in a color mix RGB node, and I'll set that here, and I'm going to set this to add. With the slider all the way at 0, it's just going to take in our generated coordinates, do nothing, add nothing, and then come out to inform our Voronoi texture. So this isn't so great at the moment, but at least we've now got something that we can add. So what we'll do is add a little bit of noise. So let's go Shift A and add in a texture noise texture, use our generated coordinates. Let's place that into the second socket, and now what we can do is increase very slightly this factor slider, and that will introduce the noise for us. Now basically we're getting a lot of larger wavy shapes, so our noise pattern is way too large right now. Let's Control-Shift-Click on this noise texture to take a look at what we get in the viewport. So we're getting these large soft shapes. So what I'm going to do here is also set this quite high, so something like 50. I'm going to take the detail up to about 5 as well. So within those overall larger blobs of color that we've got here, we get even more slight nuance to it rather than it being very, very smooth, say like 1. So let's crank that back up. And now I'll Control-Shift-Click on this Voronoi texture a couple of times to see what we've got now. And we've pretty much got it so strong it's completely obliterating many of our shapes. So I'm going to set this right down to 0 so we can see no effect. And then I'm going to hold Shift and left click and drag to the right just so that we can very slightly alter the factor slider here. It really doesn't need very much, just enough to give us a nice organic feel, somewhere around there I think. All right, let's zoom out a little bit and also show the effect of this with our lighting. Control-Shift-Click there, take a look. And yeah, I think that's a lot more of a natural overall feel. I don't like this roughness level at the moment. I'm going to set this a lot higher, so something like 0.6. All right, that's looking good. Let's try it in our look dev mode, in our different lighting setup, and I think that's looking pretty good as well. So our stones in general are a little bit on the large size. If I press N to open up the property sidebar, you can see the dimensions of this is 2 meters by 2 meters. Let's press N to toggle that closed again. And for that to be 2 meters, obviously the size of these stones are pretty big indeed, but I'm just going to keep them slightly large like this to help with the amount of geometry required when we displace this. So when we switch over to cycles, come over to the modifiers tab, we have our dicing scale here. That's essentially the resolution of the amount of geometry there to displace. And the lower this is, the more intensive it's going to be. But if we just keep the texture a little bit large for now, we can get away with not having to completely shrink our dicing scale and kill our processes. All right, so I'm going to press Z and take a look at rendered. And currently we're just set to be using this bump node. I'm going to plug the displacement back in and I'm going to unhook the normal. So perhaps even now the dicing scale is actually a little too high. I'm going to try setting that down to 0.3. So even at 0.3, these little stones are looking a little bit extreme, like this pointed jaggedness. So what I'd like to do, if I press 1 on the numpad and take a look from this front orthographic, I don't want the gravel that we've created here, these little stones, to completely take the entire range of our 0.05 that we've got, our 5 centimeters. Let's make these instead just take about 2 centimeters, but without having to change our overall scale. So to do that, I'm going to take the black flag of our color ramp. So this is what's at the lower end of this scale. And if we raise this, so if I click on this and set the RGB value, so left click and drag across all 3 values so we can change them all at the same time. If I set this to 0.4, we can see that's going to raise it up. And then on the other end of things, if I click this white flag, click on the swatch. And for this one, I'm going to set at 0.6. So I've still got that 0.5 in the middle basically. All right, so let's take a look. The scale on that is looking a little bit better now, I think. for these particular stones. So now what we can introduce is kind of some elevation to the overall plane. Now we could just do this as a displacement texture in a displace modifier, but out of interest, let's see how we would approach this in our nodes. So I'm just going to take a noise texture plugged into the generated coordinates. So I'm going to shift select those two, shift D to duplicate them. And the scale is a little bit large, so I'm going to set that down to around 5. So let's control shift click on this a couple of times to be able to see it in the viewport. So before it was pretty high like this. I'm just going to set a detail right down though. So to get these mixing together, what I'll do is I'll take a color mix RGB node. So shift A, color mix RGB, drop that in there. And what I'll do is I'll take the output of this color ramp and plug that in the first socket, which will bump this stuff into the second socket. So if we take this all the way down to 0, we're just going to get the gravel stones. And if we take it all the way to 1, we're going to get our overall noise. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go full space on our node window because we're getting quite a few things going on now. So I'll go control space and that will maximize it for us. And that means I can now take this output, plug that into the height, and also plug that into this reroute node here. So we have it going into our displacement. Let's just move that slightly over. And now I'll control shift click on the principled shader and control space to minimize the view again. All right, so let's give this bumpiness a little bit of a color ramp as well. So I'm going to take that, shift D to duplicate it and drop it in the middle there. Clicking on the down arrow, I'm going to reset that. All right, so to demonstrate how this is going to work, I'm actually going to use a different texture. So I'm going to go shift A and add in a texture, gradient texture, and drop that in here. Plug it into the gradient, give it some generated coordinates, take the factor out into this color ramp, and then let's slide that up a little bit and then slide this down a little bit. Let's control shift click on this to make this absolutely clear. So we've got black on the left side and a gradient of value all the way over to white on the right hand side. And if we take a look from the side angle, we can see this orange outline of where the original plane is, and we can see how the black colors are pushing it below that and the white is pushing it above. But if we add our gravel stones to this variation in general surface height here, so let's change this to add. Let's control shift click on the shader itself to make this a little bit clear and take a look at the top. We can see all looks pretty much okay. But the problem is that we're taking some values at 0.6. So if we click on this flag here, take a look at it, and we can see we have values of 0.6 there. And over here we have values of white. We're actually getting 1.6 in some areas. So this is raising it above the scale that we've already set. Now to help us with that, we have this simple clamp value, which is only going to allow values out of here between 0 and 1. And as soon as we do that, we can see where that white, or where the addition of what's coming out of here and here equals 1 and beyond. It's just going to flatten it right out. Something else to note about this is that now with the addition of all these, it's raised it all up. So almost nothing's getting pushed much below this orange outline of this original plane's position. So we're not really using the full extent of our 0 to 1. So what we need to do is actually take the result of this and subtract it. So I'm going to select this node, shift D to duplicate it, and I'll set this to subtract. Now the idea here is instead of getting 0 to 1 values out of here, I want minus 0.5 to plus 0.5. So to do that, we're just going to subtract 0.5, which is what we have there. And if you want to make it a little clearer, we can go shift A and add in an input value and set this to 0.5 instead and plug that in. Now this isn't going to work either because we have our clamp value on, so we're not getting any values below 0 right now. So we're going to need to unclamp that, and now finally we get the full range of our displacement now happening. The only downside now is that it's a little bit on the flattened side at the top and it's a little bit flattened on the bottom, so it's clipping out slightly. And so the only thing we need to do is offset what we have on here. So if on here we've got 0.1 before our mid value, that's 0.5, and on the opposite side we've got 0.1 above it. So if we just take these values to, instead of being 0 to 1, if we just take that to be 0.1 to 0.9, we should be able to get pretty much the whole value being used for the scale of displacement that we've selected, that 0.05. Or the 5 centimeters in other words. All right, so instead of this gradient texture, of course, we wanted our noise texture. So let's plug that in, and now we can delete that gradient texture. And now we can see we get that overall bumpiness happening, and we can set the scale of that here. So maybe like 3, as we want this road to be fairly new and fairly well created. Actually, let's go in between, something like 4. All right, so with the displacement set a little bit better, let's come back over to Eevee, and we're getting a good look at what our bump node is doing. But just to keep things things clean, I'm going to set that manually for now. See, now this is technically still a beta version, so I'm going to take the bump value and plug that into the normal. All right, so we've taken advantage of the fact that our rocks are pretty large to be able to test out that displacement without having to dice and slice too heavily on our subdivision modifier. But now say we want to increase the scale of everything, or at least our gravel stones that we have here. So first of all, let's just keep things organized. So let's take this stuff here and press Shift P to parent it into a frame, and to open up the properties sidebar, and in the label we can call this, let's say height variation. And this stuff below, left clicking and dragging across there, Shift P, and I'm going to call this one gravel. And just to keep things a little cleaner, I'm going to left click and drag across that stuff, press G and raise that up, and maybe the same for this stuff. All right, so let's make these little rocks actually little. So let's come back into the gravel area. I'm going to left click and drag this across to the side to give us some space. First of all, I'm going to hold Shift and right click and drag across these just to create this little reroute node, which attaches to both of those little noodly lines there. And then typically, if we want to change the vectors of everything, it's very easy to do because we can take a vector mapping node and drop that in. And now we have these scale values that we can change, and that's going to essentially affect the noise scale value here, and it's going to affect the scale of the Voronoi texture here as well. So we can leave these values as we are because we like their relationship to one another. So to be able to alter the scale of both of them at the same time, we can do that with a node here, which is what this mapping node is doing. And what I'm going to do is turn that up to about 6. So there's 6 times many more on screen now. So that's starting to look a lot more gravelly. All right, so let's zoom in a little bit closer. Come over to where our color ramp is. And what we can do with this color ramp is we can use this right hand slider to push it down, and we can sort of flatten things out a little bit. Now the reason I think that could be useful is if we take a look at the reference, it does tend to be a little bit overall worn away or reasonably flat on top. So I think that could be useful to replicate here. And also I think if I just pull this in ever so slightly, we can kind of increase the distance between each little rock as well. So I'm going to only do that subtly though, something about there. Now another downside to using this linear fall off is that our little rocks look like they've just had the tops cut off them. So I'm going to change this from linear to a much more smoother overall interpolation, like B-spline. Let's give that a try and let the shaders compile. Yeah, that's looking a little smoother. Maybe we can squeeze these in further now. I think that'll do for the moment. And then I think we can add another little layer of variation to this. So I'm going to pull this down so that we can slot some extra nodes in here. So the variety that we can add to this layer is just flatten it out in a few places. And to do that, I'm just going to mix in what we put here with a Mix RGB node. So Shift A to add a color Mix RGB node. Now if I just drop that in right here, our auto offset option is going to slide things along for us, which might be a nice effect. That could be a decent layout for us. But if we wanted to keep everything perfectly vertical, I'm kind of stacking things like layers that you might get in a 2D program like Critter or Photoshop, then what I'll do is I'll Control Z to undo that, press G just to move that around there. And then if we look in our view menu, we can see there's our auto offset. So I'll click that, press G and drop that in, and then we can re-enable that by finding it in the menu again. There's a quicker and easier way to do that though. We have our quick favorites now in 2.8, and all we need to do is just come into that menu, right click on the item you want, and then we'll add to quick favorites. Now when we press Q over here, you can see we've got our auto offset that we can toggle. Over here though, you can still see in the various other editors that they all have their own individual quick favorites. All right, so with that in here, we are going to keep things very, very simple. We're just going to go Shift A, add in a texture, noise texture, and with this, thanks to the node wrangler, we can go Control T, and I'm just going to delete that mapping node with Control X so it maintains this connection. Left click and drag these, press G to just give us a little bit of space for a converter color ramp node. I'm going to take the factor in, and now I'm just going to select this swatch here for the second color, and you can see it's set to 0.5. That's right in the middle of our values that we have. So if we consider 0.5 as being completely flat, that's what we want to mix in. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use this and plug it into the factor slider. Now what that means is, let's zoom out a little bit. If I crunch down the white values of this color ramp, we'll make more of this texture map have white in it, and that will make us use more of this 0.5 value. So let's take a look at what that does. And as we go through there, we can see things starting to flatten. Now, I'm just going to remember to click on this clamp so that we're not getting values outside of 0 and 1 on this. Should we add any further nodes? And for this, I think I'm going to just set this up a little bit higher. So something like 15, give it a little bit more detail. So something like 5, perhaps a little bit distortion even, which introduces a little bit of a swirly fluid type distribution. And then I'm just going to play with the values here to introduce those small little patches of flatter worn down stones. Alright, so that's pretty much it for this first layer bump. Let's switch back over to cycles and check this out with the displacement. So I'm going to unplug the bump. I'm going to plug this into the displacement there. And as we can see, if we move in quite a bit, this is a little on the extreme side. So for these smaller stones, the general scale that I'm using for this isn't really working very well. So that is being controlled over here. So I'm going to set this one down to a lot closer to that middle value of 0.5. So let's try something like 0.45. And then on the second flag, let's change that down to 0.55. And now let's take another look generally around. All right, that's not looking too bad. We probably do need a little bit more geometry to work with here though. So jumping back into the modifier, I'm going to set that down to 0.2. Or perhaps 0.1. I'm getting a lot more definition throughout there now. And I think we should bring down our scale a little bit overall. So let's go 0.03, and that's a little bit better. And to unify that, I think I'll go Shift A and add in an input value node, drop that in and set that to 0.03. Let's go full screen on this just to give us a little bit more space, a little bit more clarity, and plug that into here. And let's just raise that up next to the bump node actually, and put that into the distance. Shift and right click across there, and I'm just going to have this sort of travel around this bump node like this. All right, just trying to keep things a little clean. Let's check all that in Eevee. So control space to minimize this. I'm going to switch the renderer back over to Eevee, and then we can already see kind of what the displacement is doing. But I'm just going to simplify things by just brute forcing it and just making sure it's definitely this bump node that is being used. Let's take a look at our base color here. At the moment, it's just using this flat, fairly dark tone throughout. And now let's just give a little bit of a subtle variation to this. So let's go Shift A and add in a texture, noise texture. I'm going to run this into a color ramp. So Shift A, converter color ramp, drop that in there. I'm going to take the factor out, plug it into the factor in of this color ramp. And then I'm just going to go Control T and then Control X, that middle mapping node. And then let's take a look at this, Control Shift clicking on it. I think I'll keep the scale to around there. I'm going to up the detail though. So we still have those major overall shapes, but those shapes now have a little bit more individual variation throughout them. And then I'm just going to step up the distortion a little bit to somewhere around there. And then what I'll do is this white flag, this white mark on the right hand side, what I'm going to do is on left click and drag from this base color that we already set and drop it onto that white color swatch to change it over. Now what I'm going to do is just bring these closer together, and that will really increase the contrast there. And now let's see that all working together in concert. So let's plug that in, Control Shift click on our principled shader, give it a second to update, and there we go. And now that's updated, we can just sort of play with the values here a little bit and just sort of see the subtle changes that we get there. I'm going to set that maybe around 4.5. But this is pretty subtle characteristic to this layer. Alright, so what we need to talk about next is the way that we're going to layer things together. If we were just sticking with cycles, we probably wouldn't do this. But for some real-time results in Eevee, there is a little issue that we might need to find a workaround for. So here's some basic nodes that we've been using to inform the bump of our principled shader. But if we start stacking things in our procedural textures and really start challenging Eevee, then what we can do is, let's say we move that right up to the top there. This is basically just a duplication of those nodes that we have at the bottom there, and they're just sort of linked together. So instead of using just those nodes at the bottom, let's use all of these nodes now, and that still looks okay. So let's take all these, duplicate with Shift D. I'm going to just zoom in a little bit and make this daisy chaining here a little bit easier. So I'm going to plug that into the first socket, left click and drag across these, G to slide them up. And then I'm going to connect this into the height instead now, and we'll give it a little moment for the shaders to compile. And this is our major problem. So eventually, if our procedural nodes gets too complicated, we have too many calculations happening real time, I guess we're going to max out our hardware or Blender or a combination of the two basically. And we're going to be greeted with this hard to ignore indication that things aren't quite right. Although in cycles, this isn't really going to be a problem. Alright, so back to where we were. So in Eevee, what we're going to do is actually just layer a few of these planes on top. So for a little bit of variety, instead of just having one uniform distribution of stone size across, let's kind of vary this slightly. So I'm going to double click on this plane and we'll call this lower layer. Let's duplicate this plane with Shift D and right click to leave that in place. I'm going to press 1 on the numpad to head over into the front orthographic view. And on here, I'm just going to raise this ever so slightly up. So G and then Z to make sure we don't move it on the X and Y axis. I'm going to set that to 0.01. Let's call this the upper layer. Also with this material, let's call this the lower layer. I'm going to click on this little number 2 and I'm going to call this one upper layer. So to give this some different size stones, I'm going to come back down here and I'm going to set this down a little bit lower, so to 40. So we can see these are all a little bit larger now. But of course, this is obscuring the lower layer that we have underneath this. So what we're going to need to do is reduce the alpha on this one. So in our principal shader now, we have this alpha slider. So if I slide this down, you can see not a lot appears to be happening. What we need to do is indicate in our material that we do want alpha to display in our viewport. So we actually have this area in our shader editor in the properties sidebar, which we can toggle with the N key. You can see there's this blend mode and it's set to opaque at the moment. Now we also have this on the material tab in our properties window, just right at the bottom. We have some of these settings here. So when we update it over here, it should reflect that change over here. So let's set this to alpha blend. And now if we use this slider, we can slide from one to the other. Rather than doing that though, let's give this a proper alpha mask. So let's design that right at the top here. So I'm going to use a noise texture, Shift A, and add in a texture noise. And then I'll also add in a color amp. I'll connect these up and let's take a look at what we get in the viewport if we just Control Shift click on it. All right, I think that's looking pretty good so far. I'm going to crunch these values really close together though, as I don't want much of a fall off. I either want the top layer or the bottom layer to be shown. And to get more control over this, I'm going to select this and go Control T. That will create our vector nodes here for us. And this time what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually just change this scale value somewhere around 3. So I'm imagining as this is a road that might have vehicles going down it this way, that certain things might be stretched like a rolling pin in that way. And let's just see if we can add a little bit more detail with a tiny bit of distortion in there. All right, so instead of just looking at the mask itself, let's see this in action now. So let's go full screen just to make this easy to hook up. So I'm going to take it from here into our alpha and then Control Shift click back onto our principled shader. Control space again to show our whole workspace now and just give it a moment to compile the shaders. All right, let's get a little closer in. And now we can see patches of those larger stones as well as our tiny stones, of course. With these planes stacked on top of each other, it can get a little bit tricky to select one or the other. We can, of course, just select them in the outliner, but we can get them in the viewport simply enough just by Alt left clicking. And then we get a little menu of what was under our cursor at that time. So that's going to come in handy. The other thing I'm noticing is if I get quite close and start to move around, I can kind of see that this layer is hovering a little bit. I don't want that to break the illusion. So I'm just going to press N and take the Z value of this top layer down even lower. So 0.001 and then try that again. That's a bit better. And N again to close that side panel. So Alt left click, I'll take a look at this lower layer. I'll come over to the roughness setting. I'm going to crank this up quite high actually, 0.75. And then Alt left click and then take that upper layer. The layer on top can be, let's say 0.7. So they have slightly different roughness settings to help them pop through a little bit. Let's try this also in a different lighting setup. So let's move over to our look dev mode. Next, I think I'd like to alter the base color a little bit. Let's maybe set that to something like 4. And we should probably raise the black ever so slightly on these. Nothing's pure black after all. So I'll Alt left click and grab the lower layer and do that there also. So we have 4.5, 5 and 0.3 here. I'll Alt left click and find our upper layer. Maybe we'll give the distortion a little bit something different, 0.2. Let's take a look at the bump nodes. I think what I'll do is sort of reduce how flat these are. So on the upper layer, I'll just pull this right hand slider over to the right. We can see that kind of makes them more angular on the tops now. So I'm not going to take it quite that far, but I'm not going to have it quite as far over on the left as we did before. Perhaps I'll tweak that and the lower layer as well. Bring that over, give a little bit more character onto those. And then let's take a look at the flattened patches that we have. So let's select around these, Shift P, and we'll call this layer flatten. And we have 15, 5 and 1. Alt left click in the viewport. Let's get the upper layer and we'll do the same there. Shift P, flatten, layer. We have 15, 5 and 1 there as well. So let's give that some variety. Let's try 10 and 0.5 and let's take a look. Let's also switch over to our rendered view to check that out there as well. All right, in this lighting, I'm going to add extra detail where I can. So I know we can add the extra detail on this height variation, and Alt left click to grab the lower layer to make that same change. These overall patches, we should find those as our alpha mask. Let's Alt left click so we can grab that upper layer and Control Shift click this. So I want to give this a little bit more detail. So let's try adding that to 5, and then let's take a look at the shader again. And also let's just play with the base color a little bit. And actually let's try taking this up quite high, something like 10. So much of this is quite subtle variation at this point, of course, but it's worth trying it in different lighting setups just to see what we get, just if anything sticks out, because we want our textures to be quite versatile. Limitation that springs to mind is that if we now want to alter something on both of these layers, then we're going to struggle, or at least it's going to be very cumbersome to have to change multiple settings on multiple materials. This is where we can kind of get around that with the magic of node groups. So let's go full screen with Control Space in the node editor. We've got our upper layer selected right here. Let's left click and drag over here, Shift P, and we'll call this our main mask or main alpha, something along those lines. And then this is going to be our base color. So let's Shift P across those and then base color. So down here we have the majority of our bump happening, and let's say we have our individual flatten layer happening here. Let's say we wanted to flatten both layers at the same time. So let's add that in. Let's press G across those two frames there, just to give us a little bit of extra space. And basically we want to take these, because these are quite useful, and Shift D to duplicate them, Alt P to unparent them from that frame. And instead what we'll do is press Control G to add them into a node group. Now the major controls for our node group are going to be in our properties sidebar here. What I need on the group input is a little grayscale node there. I'm just going to use this to do that. If I just click and drag from the color ramp to the group input node, inputs and outputs for the group, then pop up in the properties sidebar to the right. Now that's showing, I can hook this noise texture back up to the color ramp. And then also I'm going to take an alpha out of here and plug that one in here, but then I'm going to unhook it again. And I'm just going to rename these by double clicking on them and calling them input and output. We don't need to worry about default values or minimum and maximum outputs, as these are going to be plugged in basically. So I'm going to plug that into there, and I'm going to plug the input into the first socket here. So we're taking whatever comes in and replacing some parts of it based on these nodes with what we have in the second socket of our mix node, this flat 0.5 color or value. Now what I might do is give ourselves a little bit of a unique character in here and create a vector mapping node, which is going to allow us to stretch things out a bit. So I'm going to scale the x-axis by 5, so it should look a little bit streaky, and I'm going to tighten the contrast on these so the results of this node is a little bit more noticeable. And I think that should do for now. Now all we need to do is hook this up into our main network. So I'm going to press Q for our quick favorites and disable the auto offset while we do this. Drop that in. I'm just going to press Q again and re-enable that. Most of the time we like that on. And for this I'm going to zoom in, and I'm going to call this global flatten. And even if nothing is using this, I'm going to save it in this blend file. So I'm going to click on this little icon here. All right, with that, I'm going to set the other layer like that. So Control Space, Alt left click in the viewport, or at least after it's finished calculating, and then click on the lower layer. And then I'm going to click on these two lower areas here, drop that down, and then go Shift A and add in a group. And now we've got our global flatten there. Again, Q, I shouldn't have been so quick with that. Drop that in. Allow it to recalculate the shaders again, and then Q again, and we'll reset that auto offset to enabled again. All right, so in our viewport, we can see the effect of that now. And to be able to change it on both layers at once, we just need to simply press Tab to take a look inside this node group. And if we change these settings now, so something like 2, or keep the detail up and maybe take the distortion down, you can see we're actually affecting both layers at once. Now a little bit is on the flat side, so much of this is actually maybe too flat. So let's not have this take maximum effect. So instead of having white, let's just drop this down a little bit to say somewhere around there. So in other words, once white comes into this factor slider, it's going to use whatever's in the second socket, which is that completely flat 0.5 value that we have. And then from there, we can kind of play with the position of this and where we want those additional, more uniform, flatter patches to be. I'll try going with that for now. But of course, with all of these controls, a lot of it boils down to personal taste. So feel free to tweak like crazy and check it in many of these different settings, these different lighting setups. So now that we know the basic principle of building an extra layer, let's do that one more time, but give it a slightly different feature this time. So for example, a paint stripe going down the center line here. So let's make sure we have our upper layer selected. I'm going to go Shift D and then Z to make sure it's constrained to the Z axis. I'm going to press N to open up our properties sidebar here. You can see this first upper layer is 0.001. So this one I'm going to set to 0.002. So they're all the same distance away basically. While we're here, let's call this paint stripe white, and we'll also give this a new material. We'll duplicate this one and call this the paint stripe white as well. Let's make it about the right size. Let's press S and then X and start scaling it in. I'm going to type 0.02 to get something that looks about that thick. And then I'm not going to start on the bump just yet, but I'd like to make a change straight away on this. So instead of this being 0.03, see now this is just going to be a slight raising of paint. I'm just going to set this down to 0.01. All right, but just to speed things up in the viewport here while we work in real time, I'm going to unhook that normal output of the bump so that it's not going to try and calculate all of this stuff while we really just want to concentrate on this alpha. All right, so let's start with getting the horizontal alpha that we need first. And also I'll take this scale value and set that to 1 on X. We might need these nodes, but for now I'm just gonna keep them simple like that. So this noise texture, let's change that by using Shift S. So we're gonna switch that over to a texture gradient texture, set to linear by default. Let's Control Shift click on our color ramp here. So we're just seeing the effect of our color ramp in the view. And I'm also going to click on that down arrow and reset this color ramp. All right, so let me reposition myself over here. And what we have here is a gradient of black going into white from left to right. But what I'd like to do is fade it on both sides. So I'm gonna click on the plus icon on the color ramp. I'm gonna set that to white. So click on the swatch and drag that up. And then on this far right flag that we have here, I'm gonna click on that. I'm gonna set that all the way down to black. Now, I don't want it to raise in this kind of like triangular peak that we have here. I want to flatten that right out in the center. So I'm actually going to take this flag, slide that all the way over to, let's say 0.1. And then let's click another one and put this all the way over to 0.9. So those two inner flags are the same distance apart. All right, so let's take this back up to 1. And now we have what we need going horizontal. If we check out our reference image, you can see along the edges, we need a lot more noise happening. So let's try and implement that. So we know we need to place some noise before this gradient texture. So to do that, it's very similar as we did before. Let's reset it up for practice. Let's go Shift A, texture, noise, drop that in here. We also need a mix RGB node. So Shift A, color, mix RGB, and I'll drop that into here. So basically what we want is the pure texture coordinates coming in. And if we set this down to 0, all we're going to see is our pure texture coordinates, so the undistorted coordinates, if you will. And now what we want to do is add just a little bit of this crazy noise. But as we do that, you'll see it starts to slide off. And so we're going to need to account for that because we need this to stick into position. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to duplicate this color node, this mix RGB node, drop that in, just bring that back over there like that. And then instead of having the results of here coming out scaled between 0 and 1, similar as we did with the overall bumpiness that we did, the overall height variation where we subtracted 0.5, we're going to essentially do the same thing here. So I'm going to subtract completely the value of 0.5. So let's switch that to a subtract. And that way, when we start to add this in, it should keep the noise relatively in position. But I can see that the noise is just a little bit too large at the moment. So let's try, say, about 30 times this, so 5 times 30, 150 in other words. So let's now add that in, and that's not looking too bad. It's looking quite vertically streaked though. So I'd like to offset that by changing the scale on one of these axes, and we can do that by changing the y-axis. So I'm going to take this up to about 30 and actually take this right back down again to say something like 5 and let this do a lot of the scaling work instead. And then maybe that's a little bit too extreme because we're losing it a little bit at the edges. So I'm going to hold Shift and left click and drag on here just to make it a slightly more subtle effect. All right, now for the slightly more challenging section, which is the vertical spacing. So what we're going to do is I'm going to take all of these nodes. So I'm going to press B and left click and drag across all of this stuff. Shift D to duplicate it and raise it up. This vector mapping node, I'm going to set that back down to 1 though. This is our noise to disturb the coordinates that we're getting in, but for now I'm going to set that down to 0, so this stuff isn't having any effect. And what I'll do is show another way of creating a gradient texture. So I'm going to press X to delete that, and instead go Shift A and add in a converter, separate X, Y, Z. If we plug in our coordinates, which really, although this looks like a lot, actually it's just taking this generated coordinates. All of this is doing nothing, and then we're going to separate it. So let's Control Shift click on this to take a look at what our X coordinates doing. And you can see that's running from 0 to 1, from the left to the right side. Control Shift click it again to see the next socket down. And then what we're getting here is our vertical. Now this is what we need. So we could have rotated our coordinates using the vector mapping nodes, but I find this a slightly simpler way to go about it. So just to drill the point home, I'm going to go Control X and delete that since we don't need it. All right, so a handy little math function that we can use, let's go Shift A, converter math, and drop that in, is the sine operation. So let's plug that in there, take a look at what we've got now. Well, it doesn't look like very much, but if we add in another math node, so let's go Shift D and duplicate it and move that to the left there. Let's give ourselves a little bit more space. Switch this first one from sine to multiply. We can start to increase this value and get what now looks like these vertical intermittent stripes. Now what's actually happening, I think, is we're getting values going from -1 all the way to 1, depending on what the input is that we give it. But on screen, we're not going to see anything below 0 as represented other than black, and nothing above 1 other than white. We can get some crazy things happening if we're plugging that into a bump node, but what we're actually going to do anyway is bring in this color ramp node, and this will have the effect of essentially clamping things down between 0 and 1 anyway, so we don't need to use these checkboxes. With this color ramp, I'm going to actually reset that, and it means I'm really going to be able to crunch this right down and really tighten that edge. We kind of zoom in a little bit, we can see what we're getting. So at this point, let's bring these two together. So we've got our horizontal and our vertical. So now we're only dealing with black and white. I'll just use this multiply node here. So Shift D to duplicate and bring that to there. I'm going to have our horizontal stripes in the first socket and our vertical stripes in the second. We're going to multiply them together, but I'm going to clamp it to be on the safe side since we're after this color ramp now, which was also behaving as our clamp. And then also now after this, I'm going to duplicate this math node and add this as fall off. So I'm going to rename this to fall off just to remind us of what this is doing. I'm going to set that to power. Now a value of 1, that's not going to be doing anything. If we zoom in even further and increase this value, you can see it's changing basically the fall off between white and black. I'm going to set that around 6. I think on the vertical side, this could be probably squeezed in a little bit further just to refine that. And a couple of extra controls that we can add to this. So let's zoom out a little bit and come back here. This one is basically our frequency. So let's label that as such. But if we want to offset this, what we can do is duplicate this math node, place that before, and I set that to add. And now basically, if I hold Shift and left click on this, you can see that we can offset its position. So I'm just going to set that down to 0 for now. And let's rename that as offset. And then since this sine node doesn't actually accept a second input, we can actually collapse that with the H key. That'll make that stand out a little bit as well. And this node here, I'm going to duplicate, Shift D, and place it afterwards. If we change this to an add operation and take that down to 0, and now again, I'll hold Shift and left click and drag across this, you can see that now we can control the gap size. Since the values between -1 and 1 that we're getting, we're starting to raise those very, very dark values right up. And then once we get to 1, we essentially close the gap. So I'm going to set this to around 0.5. The frequency, maybe if we set that to around 10, we can just get 2 of these stripes, so they become slightly longer. And as for the offset, maybe we can see where we can place these. Maybe the frequency we can increase just a touch more to shrink them down a little bit. And then again, alter the offset. So I just want a little bit of black at the top and a little bit of black at the bottom, basically. All right, that's great. The only other thing I want to add to this is a little bit of noise variation, and so what we'll need to do is bring in a little bit of this, which we already had set up. So let's give that a try. I'll hold Shift and left click on here, just see what we get. So getting something quite spiky looking there, and it looks like we can take this really, really low. Maybe try setting the scale up a little bit. Yeah, something like that. All right, so what we can do is we can add this into our alpha. So I'll go Control Space now, and let's clean up the node graph a little bit. to go. So I'll drag that all the way over there. I'm going to have this plug into our alpha socket. I'm going to control shift click on our principled shader, bring that a bit further over there. And this is actually going to work pretty well as a bump map. So let's take this and also plug it into the height there. Now to clean things up a little bit, I'm going to left click and drag across these, press G to move these up. And then I'll also do that with this stuff up the top, take that to there. And also we'll plug this in to that node and also plug the bump into our normal socket. Left click and drag across this, raise that up a bit. And so we're not using any of this stuff at the moment. And now we can hit control space, let the shaders compile, and then we'll check it out. All right, let's zoom in here a little bit. It's looking pretty good. We have these streaky sections though, which is because of our noise texture here. And since our plane here is squashed quite dramatically on the x-axis, we're getting a lot of squash there. But we'll deal with that in a moment. In the meantime, I'm just going to make a quick alteration to this. So if we zoom out a little bit more and we play with this value that we duplicated, we have this one called frequency and this one called frequency. But this one really is altering the gap. In fact, if we make this more obvious by selecting this far right flag on this color ramp, and we'll select that and raise that all the way up so that it's a bit brighter and we can see what's happening. Zoom right back into the second math node here that we've got set to add. And if I just slide that, we can see that as our gaps shrinking. So let's name that as gaps. The next thing I'd like to do is take a closer look at the way this is blending into the plane underneath. So you can see it's kind of fading, which we don't really want. And what I'd like to do here is actually just change this from being an alpha blend to an alpha clip. So that setting is going to be found in the material, or in fact in our properties sidebar. So I'm going to set that over to alpha clip and allow that to update. And now what we want to do is set the clip threshold. With an alpha clip, a pixel is only going to be either on screen or not on screen at all. There's no middle ground here with the alpha clip. This is very binary stuff. Now the clip threshold is going to take the grayscale input that we've got, and with it set to 0, it's going to interpret only pure black as meaning that's what we want as alpha. But if we actually start to hold shift and left click and drag across on this to raise this value, we can shrink it in a little bit. And really I'd like to have something a little bit more about that. So somewhere around 0.25. Now something else that's caught my attention is the fact that we have our shadow mode here set to opaque, and basically we don't want any shadows here. So I'm going to set that to none. I'm also going to take our upper layer and set that to none. And while we're at it, let's come over to our rendering engine and switch that to cycles. Now it's going to try and start subdividing things and displaying them in the viewport. Now I don't really want that to happen just at the moment, just to demonstrate this. So I'm going to take the cycle settings feature set and switch that back to supported. And then let's press Z in the 3D view and switch that over to rendered. And now if we zoom out a little bit, we'll see things don't quite look how they're looking in Eevee if we switch that back. And that's to do with those shadows. So if I switch back to cycles again, we can see we're getting a little bit of a shadow from this white stripe. Perhaps it's more noticeable on this piece here. And in general, we can see some darkening from our top layer. So this is simple to fix. I'm going to take the paint stripe mesh, come over to this object data tab. I'm going to scroll down and find our cycle settings. And I'm simply going to turn off shadow. And then when we do that, this is no longer going to cast any shadows. Let's alt click somewhere here and select our upper layer. And again here, this should have a bit more of a dramatic effect if we just switch off our shadow casting here as well. Now when we take a look at this, come over to our rendering engine settings and switch from cycles back to Eevee, we can see everything's matching a little bit more closely now. All right, let's select the paint stripe and let's try and fix some of this streaking here. So let's zoom out on our nodes and see what we've got. So a very quick and easy way to fix this streaking is instead of using the generated coordinates, we could use the object coordinates. But if we do that at the moment, we're still going to get that same streaking effect because we've squished our mesh so much on the x-axis. So if we just reset that to 1, by using our apply scale. So Control A and apply the scale, and now it resets back to 1 but maintains that same size. And now we can see a more general, evenly distributed bit of, I guess, kind of grunge really. Just going to play with these settings a little bit. Maybe set this up to around 50, squeeze in the contrast to this a little bit more, but lessen the overall effect. So I'm going to set that to be quite bright and leave the other side as white. And while we're here, what we can do is give this a little bit of an option to be colored. So to do that, I'm going to add in with Shift A color mix RGB node. Drop that in there, and I'm going to set this to multiply. Once that's set to multiply, we can set the factor all the way up to 1. And this color swatch here, if we make sure that that's set to 1, basically this node is now doing nothing. I'm going to set the clamp on this as well, just so that we don't get any unpredictable effects. And really all that this is designed to do now is, if we want to colorize this in any way or darken it, we can click on this color swatch and we can set it to whatever color we want. So typical colors might be yellow or orange, perhaps red. This probably differs depending on where you are in the world mostly. I'm just going to reset that back to 1. Let's also rename this to color, and we'll left click and drag that into our little base color frame here. Alright, the only other thing I want to fix on this stripe here is that it's very flat overall. We have all this stuff at the bottom that we're not actually using, so I might use a little bit of that as a jumping off point. What I'll do is just add some very simple noise. So I'm going to take this, this and this by shift selecting on them, press Ctrl C and then Ctrl V to paste, and G to move those up. And then I didn't mean for them to pop into there, but I'm going to sort that out in a second. In the meantime, I'm just going to left click and drag across all of these and press X to delete them. Now I'm going to zoom in and grab these 3 and Alt P to unparent them or pop them out of that base color frame. And also, as I want this stuff to mix in with this information that we've already got there informing some of the bump, I'm going to lower this base color down a little bit and slot these in here instead. All right. Also a little bit of cleanup. Let's press B and border select across all this. All right, actually before we parent all this stuff, let's press Alt A to make sure everything's deselected. Then press B to border select across these, and then Shift P to pop them into a frame of their own. But I'm going to make sure this frame is selected and then press G and then move it inside the main alpha frame. And for this one, let's call this horizontal. And then all of this stuff at the top. So let's press B to border select across that. This is all our vertical stuff. So let's go Shift P again. Make sure this frame is selected and then drop it inside that main alpha frame. And then let's name this vertical. All right, I'm going to go full screen with Control Space. And what I'm going to also do is just left click and drag across this, press G to slide that out. I'm going to make this a little bit easier on us because these two are for bump and this one's for alpha. So let's go shift and right click across those. Press G to move that up a little bit and shift and right click across this. I'm going to reroute that down there just to separate that a little bit. And now what I'd like to do is merge this stuff in with the bump that we've already got. To do that, simple enough, we just need a math node. Shift A, converter math, drop that in there. I'm going to set that to multiply, clamp it, and then take what we've got here and set that into the second socket. Now we're using pure black on this at the moment and the scale is relatively large. I'm going to set that to object as well, so it's not all streaky by default as you often get with the generated coordinates. And then with that, I'm going to left click and drag across these, go Shift P, and let's call this simple general unevenness. That's a terrible name, but let's just go with it. All right, let's go Control Space and zoom in on this simple general unevenness. Let's see what we've got. Let's try with this slide a little bit. I'm going to take that down all the way to the left side. I'm going to increase the scale on this quite a bit, maybe to something around 100. Take the detail down a little bit, and the distortion, perhaps we can leave off. A lot of this is just down to personal taste, of course. And then maybe we can flatten some parts of it, smooth over the gradient from the flat top to the rest of it by switching this to say something like B-spline. And then with the leftmost flag, I'm actually going to raise that up so it's not pure black, and that's kind of going to control our strength. So first I'm going to wait for it to compile, which it's got now. And so as we raise this up, we're going to soften the overall effect. But I'm just going to leave it around there, I think. Let's zoom out and take a look. Alt A to deselect. And yeah, I think that's looking pretty good. I'm going to lessen the contrast of our base color here, the gray splodges that we've got. I'm just going to raise those up a little bit more, just to make that a little more subtle. Let's have an overall look around this now. Let's check it out in some different lighting as well. So I'm going to switch over to our look dev mode, click on the down arrow, click on the sphere and try something else like this, or maybe this. I think they're working pretty well. I think I want the alpha mask to just be a little softer though, the transition between these. So I'm just going to go back over to our rendered view because we can kind of still see that here. So I'm going to click on our upper layer, find our alpha stuff. The node's controlling that alpha right here. And these are quite tightly packed, creating this very harsh blend. So let's try softening that off slightly. You can play with exactly where that emerges as well. And perhaps we can also change the color slightly and just try and match it a little bit more, something like that. But hopefully we've still got plenty of variation throughout. And now a nice little test for this would be to grab our light that we have here, which is right up here in our scene, and I can lower it just off to the side and make our bump map really fairly extreme. It's really working for it now. And with that, let's make a couple of final tweaks. So with this paint stripe, I can click on the color swatch here and lighten this and sort of reduce the bump amount happening there. Let's just zoom out a little bit more again. Yeah, I think that should be okay. The large stones that we have here, let's make them actually quite small. So let's find our gravel here. And which ones have we got here? We have our Voronoi texture scale. Let's try setting that to 60, which looks very similarly sized to our other stones. Let's just check what they're set to on our lower layer. We have that set to 58, the gravel 58, so there's no surprise there. Let's go back to the upper layer and set that to maybe something like 80 instead. Also, something that I'd quite like to do is give all of these stones a little bit more space. So the space at the moment between the individual rocks, our little gravel stones here, they all seem a little bit too tightly packed. So I'm going to grab this here. As we raise that in, we can see the distance between these. And let's give the lower layer the same treatment. Let's take this lower flag on our gravel's color ramp and push that towards the center, and we should separate out those stones as well. Something like this. Let's take another look overall, and I think that's looking pretty good. What we can do with this extreme angle of this light here is combine the look dev mode with that light. So we can click on here and put scene lights into it, and maybe take that light, and I'll come over to the energy settings of it and set that down to say something like 300, and that's looking pretty good. Let's try some other look dev scenes. For example, this dark one. Let's toggle the lamp off, and let's try another. And yeah, I think I'm liking that overall. A quick addition we can of course make to this is just to give it some extra lines. So I'm going to go Shift D and middle click and drag to lock this X axis here, and then left click to drop it into position about there. And then I'm going to duplicate that material and call this paint stripe yellow instead. I'll zoom out, come over to our coloring and give it that yellow. Something around there, and then I want to remove that gap, so I'm going to come over to here and I can select this math node here because it's taking our horizontal stripe and then multiplying the vertical stuff that we've got on top, so we don't need any of those nodes. So I can just select that one and press M and then give it another moment to compile, and that's done. And then let's zoom in a little bit and then go Shift D, duplicate it again. Maybe I'll try and squish this one down, so I'll go S and then X and scale that down a little bit further, and maybe we can get away with that a little bit. Just gonna nudge that over to the side, shift select those two, Shift D and then X, and then move those to the other side. We'll go R to rotate and then Z to look it on the Z axis, and then I'll type in 180 just to spin those round, and then just offset them slightly with G and then X, and then left click to drop them into position, Alt A to deselect, Control Space to go full screen, and let's zoom in and take another good look at this. Perhaps we'll take those two little skinnier versions and go Control A and apply the scale on them so they don't look too out of place. But yeah, I think that's looking pretty good as a clean section of road.
Alright, so that brings us to the end of the road, pun intended. Congratulations for making it this far. I realise this one is quite a long one. And on that, please let me know if you prefer these kinds of longer, deeper dives into something, or whether you'd prefer a shorter and quicker to achieve type project. It's always an eternal struggle trying to find the right balance on that one, so any help is much appreciated. Anyways, thanks for checking it out. I hope it's been helpful, and I'll see you next time.